going to get started here. Thanks again for joining, everybody. Another installment from the Traction webinar series. Today, we have an all-star cast, and we are going to be talking about protecting your business during pandemics. I'm your moderator for today's session. I'm Russ Armstrong. I am with Boast.ai. I am the head of sales for Eastern Canada. I was previously a co-founder of a technology company, so familiar with some of the situations and the decisions that some of our people joining us today are going through and making tough decisions. The presentation today is brought to you by Boast.ai. Boast is automating your tax refund process, the SR&ED program in Canada, the R&D tax incentive program in the US, also Launch Academy, Venbridge, and the Lazardius Institute. So excited to get going here today. Our agenda for today, we're going to bring you kind of like a full scope of the current pandemic that's going on. We have some amazing frontline physicians who are going to give us an update on COVID-19, the situation here in Canada and the US and overseas, and discuss some of the things that might be top of mind for you guys. After that, we're going to be talking about navigating these difficult times as an entrepreneur and a founder of a company, some best practices for working from home that we're going to share with you to help you and your team overcome this difficult time. Some of the financial relief programs and support programs that the governments have enabled and are offering to entrepreneurs and to small businesses to kind of weather this this tough time for a lot of us. We'll talk about how that's impacting the credit markets and some of the what we're seeing out there in terms of the equity markets as well, and then about your cash flow management and managing your cash flow during this time. So that's kind of the agenda we're going to go over today. Just from a housekeeping standpoint, we will be recording this and sending the slides plus the recording to all the participants after the fact, so keep that in mind. And then if you go into the chat window there, you can enter any questions that you have, enter it throughout the webinar, and we'll have a Q&A period at the end where we'll get to those. Hopefully we get to all of them, but if we don't, we can definitely take them offline and answer those after the fact. So other than that, we are going to get started here, and we're going to kick it off at the top with some of our expert speakers in the medical community. We have Dr. Howard Ovens, the Chief Medical Strategy Officer at Sinai Health Systems and Staff Emergency Physician at Mount Sinai Hospital. We also have Dr. Vivetta Lobo, Director, Emergency Ultrasound and Clinical Assistant Professor at Stanford University, and Dr. William Schneriak, the co-founder and CEO of RocketDoctor.io, an assistant professor at University of Toronto. So without further ado, we're going to kick it off with Dr. Howard Ovens to kick it off, and I'll turn it over to you to get us going.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to join you today and to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues. And I'm going to start by going back a bit. My story goes back to 2003 when Toronto was quite hard hit by the SARS outbreak. And my hospital in particular, I was the chief of the emergency department at that time, was an active treatment center for SARS patients, and we assessed many SARS patients at the time. And the SARS virus was nasty, but we were able to deal with it because of a couple of specificities of it. One was that although it made you quite ill and had a high mortality rate, it wasn't very contagious until you were pretty sick. And so usually that meant you were already in hospital. And so once we figured that out, a hospital is a controllable environment. And internationally, once we learned how to identify and protect ourselves from patients who are contagious and apply some old-fashioned shoe leather in public health and track down their contacts, we were actually able to contain and eliminate the virus from the world. In contrast, this virus is nasty in that it does not make most people that ill, and yet it's contagious at mild stages of illness and possibly even before you have symptoms. And so there's a large number of people walking around spreading the virus who feel quite well. And those people are hard to find and to isolate and to trace all their contacts. But it's not like flu. It's more contagious. It spreads faster. And it's also makes you sicker in higher numbers, not as bad as SARS, but enough that when you apply it to the large number of people who are impacted by it, you get very high morbidity and mortality rates. And we've probably all heard, if you've been listening to the news, who hasn't, about the two extremes of age, that this isn't a very bad illness for young people, especially those under the age of 19, and it's a really bad illness for people as they get older, over 60, and especially over 70 and over 80. But that's made young adults a bit blasé about it. And although their relative mortality rate is much lower than older people, it remains significant. And when you apply it by the large number of young people who will be, young adults, middle-aged adults who will be impacted, the number of them who will be very sick in ICU and the smaller number who will die are really non-trivial, and even for that group, much higher than in the flu. So this is a serious illness for just about everybody but children, although children can be carriers and carry contagion. In Toronto, if we go to the next slide, we have had a good head start on this virus in that early on, the returning travelers from China generally were identified, isolated, and contained. But once the disease started to get in greater numbers in the US, especially without us knowing that it was a hot spot, and so many Canadians going to the US for travel and pleasure, returning travelers from the US who were not concerned with mild illness, thought they were not at risk for COVID, started spreading it in Canada. And Toronto's had a significant outbreak now for several weeks. Unfortunately, it's gotten into our long-term care facilities in very significant numbers. And we also had our lab capacity overwhelmed early on. So there was some delay in processing swabs, which has now been cleared up. But because of the delay in processing swabs, it looks like we have a very exponential rise in our number of cases over the last several days. Some of that is backlog. The deaths have been rising very quickly because there's a disproportionate number of elderly people who have been affected early on, unfortunately. But if we look at our ICU cases, they're rising linearly. And that's actually a relief. Linear rise is much better than exponential rise. And so we remain guardedly optimistic that we can bend the curve. And so that, I'd like to talk about what that means, what'll happen after we bend the curve. But I think I'm going to turn it over now to Vivetta, who will give us a bit of an update on California.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm out in California, and we have been, thankfully better off as some of the other states in the U.S. have been. But we've still, we saw a pretty significant rise early on. But due to some of our efforts as a state level with shelter in place, I'm in the Bay Area, and we were the first in the U.S. to put the shelter in place in the country. So I think that has helped us, we're hoping that has helped us flatten that curve a little bit. And we're just starting to we're about 3 weeks in, and we're starting to get some reports on that. And but in terms of total number of cases, we're close to 7,000 now. And, kind of like what Dr. Ovens was saying, it's sort of held true as far as the elderly being more affected and the younger folks not being as much. However, as why testing starts to hopefully happen, at this point, we're still testing people who have symptoms. You kind of have to have at least some symptoms to get tested in most locations, and at least it's widespread. The testing times have been taking anywhere from 2 days to up to a week at some locations. And so we're hoping that more people get tested. We get a better sense of the true prevalence of what that is, and how many are these asymptomatic carriers walking around. But that's, that's sort of our trajectory. Personally, out at Stanford, we've had a steady trickle of these patients coming through. Thankfully, most, about 70% or 80% even, I would say, have been discharged and been able to manage their symptoms at home. But we've had about a 20% admission rate this part, with about 6 to 7% being in the ICUs of that. and requiring ventilator support. So it's, we're cautiously optimistic that we can try to flatten this curve now that we've had some of these efforts. We've extended our shelter through the month of April, going at least into May, if not beyond that at this point.
So if we could go on to the next slide. So I think what's on everybody's mind is what's going to happen, especially business people, is what's going to happen next. And there's really a fascinating international, global experiment going on as different countries with different politics, healthcare systems, and cultures apply strategies slightly differently. But the only strategy we really have right now is physical distancing and trying to interrupt the chain of contagion. And we believe, depending on when you start that it can take anywhere from 3 or 4 weeks at the best to 10 or 12 weeks to flatten that curve and reduce the number of new cases down to a trickle. And then what do? Well, we can't really go back to life as we used to know it until we have herd immunity, but we can't get that all at once or we'll overwhelm our hospital system and drive the mortality rate higher. We can hope for a vaccine, but vaccines are not a slam dunk. We don't have any other coronavirus vaccines, and we have to test them for efficacy and safety before we can change our behavior. And that could be anywhere from a year to more away. So what are we left with? We can always pray that the virus will mutate, but we can't really hasten that. So we're left with what one of the authors in one of the links calls the hammer and the dance. So some combination of physical distancing, then ramping up your lab capacity and surveillance strategy, and your public health ability to do contact tracing, and then perhaps introduce some slow and gradual liberalization of lockdown and let some businesses get back to normal, allow slightly larger gatherings of people, all the while taking monitoring the situation carefully through your lab testing and surveillance protocols, so that if the number of cases starts to rise, you can dial up the lockdown procedure until you have it under control again. And that's what the author was referring to as the dance. And we could have multiple waves over the next year as the virus ebbs and flows, with waves being precipitated by new travel cases, which is what they're concerned with in China right now, or with new waves being precipitated by a loosening of physical distancing restrictions, and all the while hoping that in a controlled fashion, herd immunity is accruing. And if you think about what life's going to be like in the next year and start to adapt to it, it's pretty clear that there are some things that are extremely high risk that we may not see for a good while. And those include international travel. Unless you quarantine newly arrived travelers, it's very high risk to allow international travel, because your country then is at the mercy of the weakest link in the world. Large gatherings like personal events, weddings, and things like that of many hundreds of people, sporting events, trade shows, conventions with thousands of people. I think those things are not going to be seen for a good long while, but smaller businesses and smaller gatherings we may see start coming back. So that's my speculation on the future, and I'll hand it back to Russ and my panel members, panel colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was super informative and great to hear. I had just one quick question just off the back of that. In terms of testing for the immunity after you've had it, is it possible to test after the fact to see if you're immune to it?
Well, we can test for the presence of antibodies. At least researchers have developed these tests. They're not in wide commercial availability. The problem is that we don't really know how long, we don't know which antibodies provide protection, and we don't know how long that protection will last. So the test is a first start, but we need some clinical research to guide us to what the meaning of these tests are. The whole herd immunity idea is that unfortunately, because many people will have been ill without being tested, if the immunity is lasting, there will be a lot of people who could take on essential jobs and start returning back society back to normal if we knew they were immune. But right now it's very hard to know who's immune and who's not. So just like we need a lot of research on vaccines, we need to take these new antibody tests, not only ramp them up in number, but start doing some careful research to find out what they're telling us about who's safe and who isn't.
The other thing with this virus that's significant is the incubation period we know is at least 2 weeks, but the amount of time that you can shed the virus after you've been infected and now totally asymptomatic is still significant. You know, in some reports, it's even another 2 weeks. And so that's a whole month where you could be potentially spreading this virus. And so that's why, you know, there's a lot of people looking to China right now because they, you know, there were reports that their numbers went down to 0 at some point, but now as life is starting to pick up, and I'll turn it to Dr. Cherniak to speak more about this, but we're really looking to see, you know, what's going to happen, you know, and there's already reports of maybe some prevalence of some cases being picked up.
Yeah, thanks. And not to throw a wrench even more in this, but the tests that we have currently are not 100% sensitive. So there are, you know, there's clear evidence that some patients who get swabbed and get called to say your test is negative actually may still have the disease, in fact. So we just have to kind of stay cognizant of that if people have symptoms, particular people who are in hospital. If they test negative, you know, we've done CAT scans of their chest and we can see they actually look like they have the virus in their chest, and then they eventually do become positive. So just sort of something for that, just to throw a wrench in the testing. And then from the China perspective, sort of an interesting anecdote personally is one of my brothers teaches at Shanghai University and actually just went back to China I guess it would have been exactly 15 days ago because he was just released from quarantine at home yesterday. And yeah, they've started to see upticks of cases from returning travelers and even travelers, you know, coming from other places who are now bringing virus back into the country. And so they've just actually stopped allowing anybody who's not Chinese from coming back, as far as I'm aware, very recently.
Wow, that's pretty amazing stat there. Very interesting. So want to thank you guys again. And if any of our attendees have questions, we can put them in the chat and we can come back to these and return to that segment a little later in it. But for now, we're going to keep driving forward here, and we're going to talk with some of our funders and discuss the investment landscape and potentially have some advice for some of our companies out there. So for this, we've got Garen Hellman, the CEO of Venbridge. And I think Garen's going to start it off, and then we're going to have Vignesh Ravikumar, principal at Sierra Ventures, to chime in after that. But Garen, over to you, and love to hear your thoughts on, you know, the funding landscape.
Thanks so much, Russ. So I'm just going to speak about a couple of experiences that I've had. I spent some time with a Canadian company that became a unicorn back in the day, running our Asia Pacific area. And so I was in Mumbai in 2005, and I was driving around to a bunch of clients, and we were about to go to the Times of India, which was going to be one of our larger clients. And the person was driving me around and said, you know, it's starting to rain quite a bit. I think we should head back to the office. And I looked outside, and it looked like any tropical rain that I'd seen in the past. But, you know, I said, okay, you know, this is a really important meeting with the Times, but, you know, I trust you. So let's go back to the office. So went back to the office, and boy, did it rain. So to give you an idea, it's 37 inches of rain in a 24-hour period. It's the 8th largest rainfall ever recorded. And so if that were to be snow as an example, it would cover every house in every neighborhood. It snowed out in the East Coast this year when they had that terrible storm, about 70, 80 centimeters of snow, which was 7 to 8 inches much less rain than that. So it was an enormous amount of rain, and over 1,000 people died. And I was caught in the middle of this thing, so I just have a little bit of experience from it, and I wanted to share with you what I learned being in this very, very difficult time. So the first thing is stay calm. I have never seen a group of people, and obviously there's millions and millions of people in Mumbai, work together, help each other, and become a group of people that really cared about each other in a time where there was no one else to help except your colleagues and your friends. And I was with my colleagues in the office. We left at some point in time, and we had to walk through these streets, which were completely flooded with water, with the waste from the sewage system, with animals that were floating because they were tied down and so they weren't able to swim properly. But it was really, really a very difficult time. But what amazed me was in a city which is typically so chaotic, how everyone was so calm and how that really helped in really allowing people to get to where they needed to be and to reduce the effects of this awful disaster that was occurring. The next thing was to trust the experts. So I know that with coronavirus, every day I'm listening to the news, I'm reading, I'm trying to form my own opinion. I try to understand this in a great amount of detail so that I can potentially advise others. And what I learned from both SARS and also this was that the experts really just need to be trusted and listened to. We shouldn't try to form our own opinion. We shouldn't try to skirt around the edges of what is possible and not possible. If people are saying to stay at home, we simply have to stay at home and not to form our own opinions, because no matter how much we try to, those experts have much more knowledge, have everyone's interest at heart, and are doing the best for everyone together. So if we listen to everyone who are the experts, and especially it's mainly coming through government sources these days, but if we listen to them, they will give us the right advice and we'll save lives together. The other thing I learned, which was quite interesting, was that everyone's a leader and to focus on what you do best. There wasn't when money doesn't matter anymore, when you're caught in something this chaotic, and when really it's not the time to learn how to swim. If you know how to swim, then you're better off than others. If you're in good health, then you're better off than others. If you know how to act in times of emergency, then you're better off than others. But just focus on what you know how to do best and work in a team so that everyone can work together and everyone becomes a leader of their own domain of what they know how to do best. It's not time to learn how to swim when you're caught in a flood. And in this time of coronavirus, it's really time to focus on what you understand and know how to do best and see if you can provide that service to anyone around you. So while I was walking through this chaos, we ended up, and it was me and about 4 other people at this stage. One was a man of a little bit over 70. One was the managing director of India. There was a lady with us, and one other person. And I end up walking through what is known as one of the largest slums in the world. And by the time I got there, my shoes had completely disintegrated. And I needed to buy some shoes. And I had a little bit of money on me. And so I found a store that sold sandals. And I asked him for some sandals. And he would not let me pay for the sandals. It was quite an incredible experience. So this is one of the poorest places in the world, one of the largest slums in the world, and there was one of the most giving experiences that I've ever experienced. And it really made such a huge difference to my perspective on the Indian people, on the culture, and it just showed that every single person, no matter how much you do have or how little you have, that by putting in the best effort that you can, that it really makes a huge difference. And so if you can, donate what you can, help where you can, do what you can. It's not about yourself anymore. It's about how we can help everyone around us and ensure that everyone's safe and secure. So this obviously ended at some point in time. We finally got to the hotel that I was staying at. All 5 of us always stuck together. And so we finally got to the hotel. And as I said, we were with a lady. So I gave the lady the room key because obviously she was, we were all completely filthy. Her sari was in tatters, and so she wanted her to get nice and clean. And I went straight to the bar with everyone else, and we had a gin and tonic, and we were treated like nothing had happened at all. And so we knew that by then we had survived this, and we were going to be safe, and everyone around us was going to be safe. Unfortunately, it was the cell towers did not have any backup power, so we could not contact anyone because there was no electricity left in the city by this stage. But everyone from the office was safe. And I think it was because of the calm and collectedness and working together and kindness of everyone that it was for us at least, it was a good story that did end, and life came back to normal within 3 days. The water went away, and we were all I mean, we all learned something from this that unless you'd been through the experience, you really wouldn't have had an opportunity to understand. So the next thing was SARS, as Dr. Ovens was pointing out. It had a significant mortality rate. I was living in Hong Kong running about a 150-person company. And this was really before work from home was prevalent. It was very difficult to do. So again, we had a few lessons from here. But first, a little bit about the background of this. As Howard said, it didn't really transmit as rapidly as we see coronavirus, but there were specific hotspots associated with this disease. And it became very apparent very early on that the best way is to isolate everyone that had symptoms and keep them away from people who were healthy. And we're seeing something similar here. But because this disease is able to spread so easily without people knowing about it, it is even more important for us to isolate. The other was communication. So there was a lot of concern. You could imagine a 15% mortality rate. A lot of people were very concerned that they would contract this and really not be able to survive it. And so from a leadership perspective, one of the keys is to be able to effectively communicate with your organization. That's video calls today that we have the ability to very easily communicate compared to back then. It's much easier to communicate today. And the more communication you have that's succinct and are able to really give people the comfort level that they're being cared for, that they're part of a team, that they have effective leadership, the easier we'll all get through this together. So don't overreact and don't underreact. So when I was running the company in Hong Kong, it would have been easy to say to the 150 people, everyone go home and let's just shut down the operation so no one can potentially be exposed to anyone else. But we decided not to do that. There was one lady in our office who lived in a place called Amoy Gardens, and Amoy Gardens was a hot spot for this disease. They ended up finding out that the sink traps, which would prevent the sewage from coming back into the apartments, weren't working properly, and those people who had SARS would infect other people's via the sewage system, and that's how come the entire apartment building got sick. So we did have one person who lived in Amoy Gardens, and she stayed home, but we certainly didn't send everyone home, and we certainly didn't tell everyone, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. So, you know, take the proper amount of precautions, but don't overreact. So now we take a look at what's going on with coronavirus in Canada. From all the experts, they're all saying that at least where we are, that the peak is not here yet. It will come and it's likely to happen in the next couple of weeks. And if we're all doing our job, we'll flatten the curve, we'll allow the hospitals to be able to take in all the people that they need to and care for all the people that they need to. The pandemic may go on for 18 months. That's a long time. So it's important that everyone mentally, physically, and financially prepare for the long run. And all those things are very important. So physically, you know, I've heard a lot of people having great meals at home and drinking lots of wine, but it's really important also to make sure that you're staying in good physical condition, because we might be in this situation for quite some time, maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months, but still it's important to mentally and physically prepare for the long run. And ensure you're doing everything now that can be done to ensure the continued success of your businesses, because our businesses and the businesses in Canada are all good businesses. They all have something to offer. They were all doing very well previously. And so the question is now, what can you do to ensure that when this is over, we're able to have a continued successful business? And I'll get into a little bit how you could take advantage of some of the programs that we have from the federal government. So just a little bit about the public and private markets. So I think it's generally well accepted that the private markets for capital will lag the public markets. You've seen a very large contraction in liquidity, which means that there's not as much money on the street to fund anymore. And that's both through financial institutions for lending and also for equity markets for inserting venture capital. So that is something that I think people should be aware of, that it's most likely still going to be some time before we have the equity markets bounce back. But this is an interesting graph right here where you see that overall the EM Cloud Index, which is heavily weighted to SaaS companies, is doing much better than other companies, overall other indices. So I think there's a lot of hope for technology companies, and if you can survive this and continue to serve your customers well, I think we have in the technology world a much better prognosis. Okay, so a little bit about the SR&ED program, and I apologize to the folks from the US on the call here, but basically it's important because the SR&ED program provides a lot of liquidity to technology companies. And so the CRA has been declared an essential service, which means that for the most part, the CRA is operational, but they are not at 100% because they're having challenges working remotely and some other issues. But for the most part, they are at work. So the claims are still being processed. We still see claims coming in, notice of assessments, and checks being issued. There is most likely a higher threshold for audits, which means that there's less of a chance that if you claim now that your SR&ED claim will be subjected to an audit. And that is just simply so the CRA could spend time doing other things which are very important, such as dealing with EI and some of the other programs which will run through the CRA. So the key is to try to get your claim as soon as possible, because when the CRA opens up the doors and is starting to process a lot of claims, which we expect to be next week, they're most likely going to process them very quickly, and the checks are going to be issued very quickly. But the sooner you apply, the faster you'll get your money. If your claims were filed electronically before March 31st, then it's just a waiting game now, and you should be able to get your claim very soon. If they're filed by paper, my strong suggestion is you try to file them electronically. If you're filing a claim this week, then you'll most likely get your claim very, very quickly. I was on the phone with someone who told me that that Revenue Quebec is doing a great job of cutting checks. And the challenge is that they sent out 4,000 checks within the last couple of weeks, and 3,000 have been returned. So the federal government allows you to set up electronic banking, and it is very important that you set up electronic banking so that when your SR&ED claim is refunded, that they deposit directly to your account rather than sending you a physical check. So I'm not going to go through any of these in detail, but basically these are the funding mechanisms available to entrepreneurs and small and large businesses also. There's $40,000 in emergency liquidity support, which is a loan, and you can repay it early or up to December 31st, 2022 and get a $10,000 off of the $40,000. So that will be available to apply for through your banker on the 6th of April. There are programs which are for larger companies through the Business Development Bank of Canada. You'll see a few links at the end of the presentation of how to apply for those. So if you are qualifying or if you're an existing BDC client, you should certainly ask your representative what is available and see if you can qualify for their additional funding, because the interest rates are incredibly low. And then there's obviously the secondary lenders in the market. While liquidity's still tight, there's operating lines, there are asset-based lenders. You could try for some invoice factoring, and there's SR&ED and tax credit lending, which is what we do, which is basically if you haven't filed your claim or your claim's coming in a few months from now and you need the liquidity today, you could get a loan against your SR&ED tax credit. So the final side is that cash is still king. So focus on your model and your best and worst case scenario. I know the models are very dynamic these days, but really you got to try to figure out what your worst case scenario is and plan your business accordingly. And so that you have that cash runway, if it's through raising additional equity, which is still happening, or taking on additional debt, or friends and family, however you can. Obviously, some companies are still increasing their revenue today. So consider what you can do to have that runway and be able to sustain the business, ensure that you're doing everything you can to retain your employees. I know how hard you work to get them in the first place, and so it's really important that you're able to retain as many of them as possible and be really quickly in claiming all your government grants. So I'll hand it back to Russ now, and over to the next person.
Yeah, Garrett, thanks very much there. Just a quick question for you before you jump off
Sure.
there. What are you seeing just in terms of credit markets out there, just across the board, just with everything going on? Are you seeing anything interesting?
So I see the venture capitalists, and we have one on the phone, which will give us a little bit more insight. But they're investing in their own portfolio still. They're still ensuring that most of them kept dry powder available to continue to invest in their own portfolios. There are very few new deals being done today. But I really see that being a very short-term effect. I think that the smart ones and the ones that have raised capital over the last number of years, who have that sitting on the sidelines, will start to deploy it within the next 2 to 3 months.
Interesting. Very cool. Appreciate that. Well, let's turn it over to Vignesh now. Vignesh, you're there on the line. We'll get you and your thoughts from what you're seeing at Sierra Ventures as a principal, and maybe you could speak to some of the other VCs and kind of what their strategy is going forward.
Yeah, sure. And then I think wanted to mention that Alex will cover some of the U.S. funding programs later. But yeah, so I'm happy to give some kind of color there, and happy to answer any questions as well. And just as context, as I kind of go through the slides here, the perspective that I kind of took was, obviously over the last couple of weeks, like most VCs, been mostly doing portfolio triage and trying to make sure that our companies stay alive and the situations are okay. So really kind of the advice here and kind of the comments that I'll make are really based around kind of what we're discussing with our companies and how we're guiding our companies. So with that, I think first things first, the number one goal right now is protect your existing book of business. I think we all know that sales are going to be slowing down in Q2, Q3, and maybe even into Q4. And so at this point, the best dollars that you can spend on the sales and marketing side is to protect that existing book of business. And kind of going back to Garen's slide around why SaaS companies have performed so much better. It's because you have that existing recurring book of business now. I think and I'll cover this in a second slide, but billings are going to be light over these next couple quarters, and customers that know that you won't shut off their service, probably going to try to defer paying. But it's really important that you kind of go in from this year to next year with strong confidence that you have that recurring base. And we'll talk a bit later about kind of how VCs will view 2020. But I don't think growth is going to be the big question around everybody's mind. Second topic here is around runway. I think again, like Garen was saying, cash is king at this point, and you need about 12 months minimum, and I think more likely 18 to 24 months, and maybe even a little bit more than that, just to be safe. And at this point, you just kind of have to assume that any sort of normal business buying pattern isn't going to start until Q4 at the earliest. And probably more likely Q1, Q2 of next year. And so if you think about, being able to operate your business, you're going to need about 12 months just to get over the hump of coronavirus stuff. And once that's happened, you'll probably need a couple of quarters to kind of show new investors that you're getting back to a normal operating cadence. And so as you think about that from a timeline perspective, if you're sitting here in March, you need to, minimum of runway until about end of March next year, but probably more likely until the end of summer next year. So that way you have some time to, again, focus on shoring up the business in the short term and have some time to start selling again heading into the new year. Again, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but our expectation is that cash collections are going to be very, very light in Q2 and Q3. And again, most businesses are not going to be paying services, or are going to try to avoid paying for services that they know won't get shut off, at least in the short term. And so a lot of our companies are really trying to prepare themselves for this exact scenario. And so I think this goes back to the runway question, and we'll talk about how we've advised our companies around the cost side of things, but expect cash collections to be very, very light over these next couple quarters. Again, same point as kind of ties back to that last point. If you have deadlines, draw down on them. We've told all our companies to do the same things. The SBA loans are going to be coming out are going to, at least the applications are going to start tomorrow. If you can apply for them, I would suggest you start applying for them now. Be first in line. The way this program is going to operate is you have to go to an SBA approved lender. The SBA approved lenders are going to be the ones that are giving out the loans. The loans are going to be guaranteed by the government, but you're still going to have to apply, and there's going to be limited funding, and it's going to be first come first serve in the U.S. So if you haven't done that already or haven't prepared for that, that's something that you want to do immediately, and make sure that you go to your existing banker, so whoever's providing your bank account. So that's kind of who's going to be your primary target to go out and get that SBA loan. But again, it's all about making sure that you have cash to weather these next 2-3 quarters where you're not going to be selling new deals, and again, cash collections is going to be dicey. This is again, similar kind of comment to the billings point earlier. Across the board, we're seeing 15 to 20% cuts in spending, and in a couple of different ways. So some of our companies are freezing hiring, some are laying off folks, and then some are kind of reducing salaries. Again, this is literally across the board. I don't think I have a single company that's not implementing something like this. And I think at this point, it's time is really the most important thing. What we've been advising our companies around this topic, though, and in general, if you're going to be making drastic measures like this to either freeze hiring or lay people off, make your plan and cut deep, but cut once. You don't want to have to go through multiple rounds of layoffs and hiring freezes and salary reductions. That really just kills morale. At this point, I think people are more concerned about long-term job prospects and stability, and so we found that for the most part, companies have been pretty receptive and okay with, or the employees at our companies have been pretty receptive and understanding around some of the measures that our companies have had to take. But the expectation, and good companies, with the good companies in particular, the expectation is that once things return back to normal, people will get paid back, the money that they missed out on. But right now, it's really about survival. Trim the fat. I think this is actually an important point and a nuanced point, just because some companies, I have a couple in my portfolio that had just raised going in going into this year, and so from a cash position are pretty okay. They're seeing this as an opportunity to, if there were performers that you were already kind of on the fence about, and you're thinking about, you feel pretty good about your cash prospects for the next 18 months, as well as kind of how your business is going to play out over the next 18 months. Take the opportunity to cut costs. And I think in general, as we've watched companies, SaaS metrics and SaaS ratios have started to get a little out of whack. Payrolls have obviously gotten bloated over the last, call it 5-6 years. And so some companies are taking the opportunity to trim the fat. And again, these are not drastic measures when I say trim the fat, but it's, called trimming the bottom 5% of performers, if when you can. But this is kind of a first world problem in this environment. And these are for the companies that have cash and aren't concerned about surviving these next 12 to 18 months. Again, first world problem for companies that have a stable business and have cash. One of the interesting reads, and I'm happy to send this out later, but good article in the Harvard Business Review about this. But Amazon had actually gone out and raised, I want to say, about $560 or $600 million worth of debt right at the depth of the 2001 crisis, and that was actually one of the things that they credit to being pivotal in helping them navigate 2001 and come out on the other side much stronger. And at this point, what you're going to find is that competition within your spaces where folks haven't figured out their business model and are bleeding cash and aren't good businesses, and we're kind of staying afloat because of the easy money environment that we were in, are going to start dying out. And in that environment, you're going to have opportunities to make small acquisitions, build product, and start working on partnerships. Ironically enough, now that everybody's home, people that you may not have been able to get on the time of the calendar with are much more responsive, and try to aim to start setting those things up now. We've told our companies is just get something on the calendar for late May, early June, and hopefully the situation clears up by then. But if not, it's easier to reschedule than to cancel at that point. And so those partnerships that you've been chasing for some time to double down on those. On the product side, and I think this is actually specifically for seed stage companies, one of the things that you'll hear a lot in these next few months around when you're out fundraising is that most VCs are not going to want to take the go-to-market risk. They're not funding go-to-market risk, but they're more willing to fund product risk and execution risk on that front. And so this is the opportunity for companies that have products that they've been trying to build, but have had to put on the back burner because of selling pressure and growth pressure. Really good time to start hiring in advance and start building in advance of when kind of all the situation resolves itself, and kind of reprioritize your product roadmap. And again, I think overall just prepare to capitalize when the market turns, and this is across the board for everybody, right? So make sure you have enough cash, make sure that you set up you've started to set up your meetings around partnerships, and make sure you continue to talk to customers even if they're not going to buy right now, and just be ready for when the market starts to get back to some level of normalcy, hopefully around Q1 of next year. And then briefly we'll touch on 3 points around fundraising advice. I think this is important. At the end of the day, solid businesses are going to still be able to raise. I think, like Garen was saying, there's been too much money that's gone into the venture business. Now, there are some questions around whether LPs will be able to make capital calls and things like that. And so there are still some uncertainties, but so far what we've heard is that LPs will still stand by their capital commitments. And so I think when things start to return to some level of normalcy in Q1 and maybe even later this year, once people are able to meet face to face again, good businesses will be able to raise. And I think there's going to actually be a massive flight to quality, right? And what I mean by that is over the last few years, you've started to see firms that firms do unnatural things to them, right? So firms that primarily focus on late stage stuff start moving earlier, firms that focus on early stage stuff moving later. And I think folks will start going back to their roots and focusing on things that they know well. And so I think solid businesses will be rewarded in that environment. And then more importantly, I think most investors are going to view 2020 as a mulligan year. You're not going to get penalized for not having growth. I think most folks are going to understand that 2020 was really just a bad year for business, and so right now it's really about making sure that the fundamentals are strong, right? And so make sure that as we come out of this recession, or as we come out of this COVID situation, I think it's very important to have all your ducks lined up, and that's going to be what I think investors will view as good opportunities, right? So if you're a company that's selling enterprise, and obviously 2020 may be slow, but you had a chance to protect your book of business. Customers are still paying the bills. You didn't see a ton of churn, and after Q1, you're starting to see some return to normalcy around selling. I think those businesses are going to have a very good opportunity to raise. And again, the point is that there's a lot of dry powder out there, and people will need to deploy that capital. And then this is the last point, and again ties back to having enough cash runway after the situation resolves itself. Again, I think business purchases are going to be pushed off until new business purchases are probably going to be pushed off until Q4 at the minimum, probably more likely Q1. And so you need to make sure you have enough cash to, once the market starts, once businesses start buying again, getting back to a normal pace of selling, to show that you've kind of righted the ship and things are getting back to normal. And I think if you can show that you've really thought through the strategy, or I guess short up the strategy side of things over these next couple of quarters, I think VCs will be excited about investing in those businesses. So
awesome. Thanks.
Over to Russ.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was super helpful. Some great insights there. I think one thing that I always and I've answered a bunch of questions this way is all, this is not impacting every industry the same way. There's definitely some industries that are moving forward. We're seeing Zoom communications, obviously a great example, stocks outperforming any of the cloud index, digital education, video games and gaming, things that are actually growing in this segment. So I think it's something you got to take in the context of your company and who you're selling into. On the flip side of that, Dr. Ovens has stated earlier, it's going to be a while before conferences start to come back online. So any of the supporting industries around conferences, live marketing, experiential marketing, they're going to be hit the hardest over the next while, and they're going to have to plan for an even longer time horizon before they can make a rebound. So just you got to really take it in the context of your company and who you're selling into, to really figure out the plan that's going to work for each entrepreneur. Awesome. So with that, we're going to move over to Alex Polpa, the CEO of Boast.ai, my boss, actually. There we go. Alex, let me hear it. How are you managing with the situation?
Hey guys. So yeah, we're a weird business because we kind of see a positive impact out of this for now in terms of new client acquisitions and interest in additional capital like R&D tax in the US and SR&ED in Canada. So for now, the impact is fairly positive. We'll likely see some sort of impact down the line, probably delayed by a year or towards the end of this year, and that comes with sort of client attrition and uncollectibles and things like that. But let me go through a little bit go through what we do as a team and the fact that we build the business to have remote work capabilities. We do have 5 offices in 3 different countries. So we've always had a remote team and ability to work from office, coffee shop, whatever it is. So this wasn't a big change for us in terms of having everybody work from home. So here are a few things that we focus on. So relationships with the team, with our customers is obviously the number one priority. And we need to keep on fostering that, and we need to use technology and new methods to keep on doing that in this time. And we see that our customers are much more attentive at this time as well. Our team appreciates it a lot more. So the positives are that everybody does appreciate the extra effort of an outreach or providing additional information, value add information that's related to each individual or individual's business as well. One of the things we do is obviously we share as much information as we can with the team internally. in terms of, how we're doing on, as a business in terms of cash runway. We are a bootstrap business. We're not a venture-backed business. So we do look a little bit different, and we do operate very differently than a venture-backed business. But, share as much information as you can. We've always shared this kind of information in terms of our revenue, new client acquisitions, obviously, all of our performance metrics internally. We've all shared that on a real-time basis, so everybody on the team has access to that information. But we've gone the extra step to make sure that we communicated, using our communication technology, so chat, video calls, and so on, even more than we used to before. One of the things we need to do is also stretch every dollar that we have. Obviously, like everybody, Vignesh, Karen, everybody mentioned, is really important to make sure that we put our dollars to really good use. And we focus on our customers. Of course, that's the number one priority. High probability pipelines, so anything that we know, from prior experience that will convert, and low cost channels. So we put on hold a few different strategies of identifying new channels that might work for us and things like that until we get a somewhat of a sense of normalcy here, or at least eliminate some of the uncertainty that's going on in the market now. And obviously you can negotiate with vendors and cut costs where you can. Those are important, and everybody can pitch in and support each other at this time, right? And that includes us with our customers and vice versa. So we can always do more with less, right? This is a good time to learn new skills that you would otherwise outsource. So if you do find that there are members on your team that might have some additional bandwidth because the environment changes and so on. If you had outbound sales guys, for example, maybe it's time for them to focus on a new channel or a new skill set that maybe they're not as proficient at. So these are great opportunities to find those opportunities. Obviously, reforecast. It says reforecast if you need it, but you definitely need it. That's just reforecast. Everybody is impacted in some way, whether it's positive or negative. Everybody's impacted in some way, and sometimes the negative is coming down the line. So keep in mind, even if there's a positive impact now to your business, in terms of additional clients and so on, maybe you're the Zoom of the world, there is going to be some impact coming. You just have to figure out what that is for your business. But definitely you're going to need to reforecast. Enable and educate. Host online events like this one. Try to share as much information with the community and internally with the team, with your own team, with your clients. Everything helps. So all of our experiences put together is definitely more valuable than doing this alone. Foster that team culture and team atmosphere. Have virtual happy hours. Any sort of activity that encourages the team to communicate in somewhat of a normal way, like they used to. Making remote work fun is a big part of it. So everybody wants a sense of normalcy, and part of that is making sure that you stay engaged with your team as you're going through this time of working from home and working remotely. So it's not just providing the tools, but it's also encouraging the proper use of those tools and coming up with innovative ways to make sure that the introverts on your team are also engaged, not just the extroverts, and it's not just a bunch of noise that a lot of the team can shy away from, but just making sure that everybody's engaged, and align the team. This is the time to go over your mission, your values, your vision as a company. If it has changed, it's also time to communicate that as well, right? So, communicate your thought process as you're going through this. Everybody understands that it's an uncertain time, and everybody expects that I guess leadership has a plan, of course, and I hope you do. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. And that plan can be fluid and it can change. It doesn't have to be stuck, written in stone, but you need to have a plan. So set clear expectations, with your team. Those KPIs are really important. We do have real-time KPIs for every member of our team, and it is shared with the entire team, with the entire company. So make sure you have those monthly goals, weekly goals, and metrics and dashboards to keep track of that performance. Those are just some of the things that contribute to having a productive team and making sure that your team's productivity actually increases, doesn't decrease. And leverage online tools as much as you can. Obviously, you can use Slack, we use Facebook Workplace, use Jira, use whatever tool it is that you kind of decide on. Use that to make sure that you celebrate your team's birthdays, work anniversaries, client testimonials and wins, like new clients, or for us is new filings, whatever it may be. Just make sure you celebrate those, and you do it on a regular basis, not on a scheduled basis, but as these wins come along, just make sure you do it. Just make sure you communicate those, and make sure that everybody understands that life is different, but it's maybe the new normal. So encourage team bonding. So we do a weekly MVP where one team member picks this week's most valuable team member, and explains why, and how they helped and how they contributed to the team. And then next week that MVP will choose another one. So those are just the little things. We have workout of the day. So every day at lunch, the entire team in 5 different countries. Well, it's not lunchtime for everybody, but every day there's a workout. And we do murder mysteries and fun things like that you can do over chat. Just try to think differently to make sure everybody's engaged. And obviously give back, and try to give back together. It was this picture is from one of our events a few months ago, but there are many ways to still give back together as a team, even though you can't be there in person. So make sure that you support the causes that your team members are passionate about, maybe causes that their family members and friends have to rely on, and just make sure that if you're in a position to help, even a little bit, make sure you do. And this is our team offsite. Every year we do a team offsite to make sure everybody gets to know each other. Maybe this is not quite as relevant now, but plan for a year from now to have an onsite, so that the team members can have all this fun in a face-to-face way. It definitely helps and helps bring everybody together, and helps build that camaraderie that everybody wants. And support programs. So in terms of cash support that we use as a company, so we're not venture backed, but some of this stuff does fall onto venture backed or non-venture backed companies. The one thing to keep in mind is for us, especially because we're not venture backed, is only get into a debt hole that you can come out of. So this kind of goes back to planning and make sure that your revenues do come back, because you can get into a really big hole and not have and you can kill your business. You won't have the ability to come out of that. So make sure that is manageable, and take advantage of all these programs. So in the US, there's a paycheck protection program, which is 2.5 months your payroll, rent, utilities, and so on expenses. Take advantage of that, because it is forgivable. So if you have a hard time paying it back, and if you actually do use it for these expenses, payroll, rent, etc., that debt can be forgiven. So take advantage of that for sure. Retention tax credit. It's a refundable 50% tax credit on wages up to $10,000 per employee. All this adds up as you scale it across your business. SBA economic injury disaster loan. This is what Vignesh was talking about. Make sure you take advantage of that. So those applications are opening up tomorrow. But that's basically super low interest rate, long term, looks more like a mortgage. And in Canada, the same thing. So we have the 75% wage subsidy up to 3 months. So if you can show a year over year 30% decrease in your revenue, month on a monthly basis. So if your March revenue in 2020 was 30% less than your March of 2019, then you can take advantage of that subsidy. And Minister Baines actually confirmed that. So it is you have to look at a revenue on a monthly basis and compare to the prior year months. So that's how you establish your eligibility for that. There's some confusion around the 10% wage subsidy, whether it was replaced by 75 or not. So for now, we kind of keep them as two different programs, one or the other. But I think there will be more clarity coming around this shortly here in the next few days. There's a $40,000 government-backed loan for businesses. Take advantage of that. It's a good way to get to try to get by. And financial institutions are offering operating lines of credit of 10% increase for 120 days and so on. Try to take advantage of that. The other thing that you can do at this time, if you haven't seen a significant decrease in your revenue just yet, and you expect it to be delayed, make sure you shore up your operating lines of credit. So, the banks, this is a good time to go to the banks and try to increase your operating line of credit. Try to get them guaranteed by the Economic Development Canada, so EDC. They do have programs in place that will guarantee part of the loan, part of your operating lines or loans, if not the entire amount. So make sure you look at EDC programs. They'll work in partnership with your financial institution. So whatever your major bank is, that's who you're going to have to speak with. So speak to your banker and make sure you increase your operating lines and your lifeline, right, for the next little while here. Yeah, so that's my quick rundown through this. But there are some resources, U.S. government resources. There's a Canadian government resource as well, and you can always contact me, and I'll provide whatever information I have.
Awesome. Thanks, Al. Really appreciate that. That was a great synopsis of everything. Just one highlight there. Just, when everybody is working from home and isolated, you also got to consider the mental health of everybody, which is why it's so more important to get everybody engaged on a daily basis. So try to make that part of your routine and get everybody involved, because it is lonely out there. Yeah. All right, let's move on to our last, save the best for last day, John. So, John Coates, journalist for Forbes and Venture Beat. He's got some great stories for us. So let's move it into here, and over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Russ. Hello, everybody. I'm not sure they've saved the best for last. It's probably the most boring, least important section, but it's been good so far. So, there's a chance that there's something interesting here. We'll see. So right now, I call this false growth syndrome. It's not an ad for male enhancement or male pattern baldness or anything like that. But right now, you're probably seeing a lot of consumer spending and time allocations changing, and probably faster than any time in recent history. What we do, where we're spending our time, what we're buying is massively changing. So there's super tough times in a lot of industries, but you're probably also seeing some major growth stories, and I'm writing a lot of them. So I wrote a story this morning based on a recent report from App Annie. House party installs up 735x in March, right? We all know that video chatting, video facial social recognition, social networking platform, right? App use in general is up 20%. We're at home. We need something to do. Mobile spend, so not just time spent, but mobile spend, in-app purchases on Google Play or the iOS App Store were the highest in history for Q1 2020. So mobile spend in apps, highest in history for Q1 2020. That was $23.4 billion. So it's pretty impressive, right? There's some major stories there. Adobe released a report that I reported on March 31st. E-commerce in general is up 25%. And Adobe actually measures e-commerce at 80 of the top 100 US online retailers, digital retailers. Amazon is almost certainly not included there. So it's not a huge percentage, but it's going to be a significant percentage. Online grocery shopping doubled. Virus protection products, like sprays, wipes, masks, those sorts of things, up 8x, right? Cloud services, Russ already mentioned Zoom. Microsoft announced just about a week ago they were up 8x in cloud service usage, right? I recently analyzed $2.5 billion in ad spend for a client, and news spend was up 11x. Gaming was up 25%. E-commerce up 34%. Social was up about 33%. So I had a podcast this morning, my Tech First podcast. So I said, is coronavirus good for business? Actually, no. We're seeing some of this stuff right now because our allocations are changing, where we're spending our time and where we're spending our money. That's significant, and it's going to remain significant, and it's continuing patterns that we've seen for some time. It's accelerating some of those patterns, and it's going to set up those industries well for the future, but we can't act as if oh, I'm in mobile gaming. It's going to be great for me. People have lots of time. They're going to spend it in my game, and my revenue is going to increase. The reality is we saw record levels of unemployment claims last week in the US. We saw record levels just announced this morning, and another 6 million claims. So huge swaths of our economy are toast, right? Purchases are going to follow. More jobs will follow that. And guess what? Advertising will follow that as well. A lot of us in the startup world have been in ad-supported models. Well, advertising typically goes down by a factor of between 10 to 30% in a recession. If things get really bad, maybe it's more than that, right? So you've seen some good advice on this show right here about hunkering down, right? Conserving cash, focusing on client retention, focusing on survival. I think those are all good things to think about and to focus on. There are some things that are up. There are some things that are really, really good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that monetization or that your revenues are going to keep going up, even if you're in one of those spots. Back to you, Russ.
Yeah, fantastic. No, and you know, an interesting thing to kind of think about is how, you know, coming out the other side of this is going to change consumer behavior forever. And there will be some lasting effects of this, and how, you know, and some of the reasons why you're seeing, you know, people might have signed up for Amazon Prime for their first time. Are they going to go back after they've been there? And some of the other delivery services or, you know, instant services. So there's a lot of implications that are going to be lasting. And some companies are going to survive based off of that, and some of them, you know, with the changing dynamics, are unfortunately going to go away because of it too.
What we've also seen there is that companies that spent in the past few years, and now maybe the audience here is mostly startups, so they're kind of, you know, they're there already, but big companies that spent on digital transformation or ways of connecting with their customers digitally, whether online or on mobile, they're actually reaping the rewards right now.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So that's it for our kind of planned part of the seminar here. If there was any Q&A that anybody continue to have, we've got a couple minutes where we can answer any Q&A that might be out there. Wanted to kind of turn it back also to our expert doctor panel here to see if they had any closing remarks also on it. Dr. Cherniak, did you have anything you wanted to kind of close off with about the coronavirus that you might want to share with the audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. By the way, thanks for everybody on the panel. Great talks and super insightful and interesting. I really like that virtual happy hour idea. That's a good one. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit. One thing we haven't touched on too much is telehealth and virtual care. And so one of the things that I've been doing over the last few months is actually launched a company called Rocket Doctor. And so we had this nice sort of plan to launch over the next 3 to 4 months, but as the pandemic broke, we ended up partnering actually with a nonprofit that I started also called Bridge to Health to put up a voluntary question and answer service. And so we basically had over 400 site visits over the last, I'd say, week or so since we were able to launch, just sort of trying to get accurate information out to the public. And so it's a really interesting way to kind of pull medicine screaming and kicking out of the dark ages and put it into the 21st century and kind of use the power of technology. So that's just something I know Vivetta has been doing. Dr. Lobo has been doing a lot of work at Stanford around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think by virtue of the situation, a lot of people have to move to telemedicine, right? And so, you know, for us as healthcare providers too, being on the front lines, you know, this endemic has unfortunately affected healthcare workers a lot. We're seeing percentages from 10 to even 17, 18% in some of the other countries. And so, you know, if we're all sick, it's not going to help the situation. And so we are actually trying to move a lot for mutual benefit to telemedicine when it's appropriate. So at my shop, we've launched it for all of our less sick, just drive-through testing people who come through. We've had it set up in all our rooms, so we don't have to go in the room necessarily multiple times, but we can check in from you know, the iPad or from whatever on the outside. That also allows us to not have to dress and gown, because the protective gear is very limited, as I'm sure you've heard on the news. And so we can actually not have to wear that multiple times going in, because otherwise you have to wear it every single time and throw it out every single time you step in and out of that room. So there's, you know, I think when just hearing John speak about things that are going to stay. I think this change with medicine, with being more having more presence of telehealth, is going to only get stronger. And I don't think this is going to be one that'll go away when the pandemic hopefully does.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I've heard about, people, I work in Ontario, similar to Dr. Evans, and people kind of waiting on hold for 5 to 7 hours on some of the provincial health lines. And so part of the idea here is, can we help out by offering people a different chance to kind of talk to a licensed healthcare provider who can not only just give, advice, but also actually form a doctor-patient relationship in a confidential and organized way, to then offload the emergency departments and help out the family docs as well, who aren't able to see patients in their clinics like they normally would.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thanks very much, everybody. Really appreciate everybody taking some time today to join us and share your insights. All of you, greatly appreciated you sharing your expert opinions in your subject matter. Thanks very much for joining today. As I mentioned, we will be sending around a recording and a copy of the slides, so please stay tuned for that. We'll probably try to get that out to everybody in the next 48 hours. Thanks again to all our panelists and everybody who could join us here today, and appreciate it. We'll see you on the next edition of the Traction webinar series.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye.